It's Mr. Adams here, a mathematics teacher with over 20 years experience, and I've been looking at housing affordability. In this video, I'm going to explain what the issue with negative equity is and ways we can mitigate the issues. So the question is, what is negative equity? Well, let's first look at positive equity. This is where your home is worth more than your debts. Negative equity is when your debts is worth more than your home. In my last video, I looked at what happens when house prices go up and down. In this video, I'm going to do the same examples, but I'm going to include debt. In scenario 1, we're going to look at the example where house prices double over a short period of time. So if in 2024 you bought for $500,000 and you sold it a year later for $1 million, we're going to presume that you had $500,000 in debt and you make that $500,000 profit. So in effect, you've got no debt. But the issue is the house that you're also looking at has doubled in value. So that means that when you do all the calculations, you still end up with $500,000 in debt. In scenario 2, the prices don't change. So you bought it for $500,000, you sell it for $500,000, your debt was $500,000, so you've got no profit. But the house that you're looking at also hasn't changed. So effectively, you're just swapping the debt of one house for the debt of another house. So you still end up with $500,000 in debt. So let's look at the example where house prices halve. So if you bought for $500,000 and then you sold it a year later for $250,000, of your $500,000 in debt, you're able to only recoup back $250,000. So you've made a loss of $250,000. So that sounds terrible. But when you look at the house that you were going to move to, well, that's also halved in value. And when you do the calculation and work out how much debt you have at the end, you still get that magic number of $500,000. It might seem counterintuitive, but in all three scenarios, the person ended up in the same house with the same debt. So there's no financial advantage here in any of these scenarios. You might feel better in scenario 1 where house prices double. You might think things are fairer in scenario 2 where house prices remain the same, or you might feel worse when you sell your house at a loss in scenario 3, but ultimately you end up in the same house with the same debt, therefore there's no financial advantage in any of these scenarios. So the big question here is what happens when you default. So in scenario 1, that $1 million house, if you had to sell it, you'd make a $500,000 profit once you paid off your debts. In scenario 2, there's no profit because the house is worth $500,000, your debt is $500,000. But when it comes to scenario 3, you do make a $250,000 loss. So in scenario 1, you end up with more money than the other scenarios, and you can use that leftover money to buy a different house. But the key here is that it will need to be half as good as the original house because house prices have doubled. In scenario 2, you end up with no money and no house. Given that you're able to afford a $500,000 loan, potentially you could get a lesser home and lesser house. There is no sugarcoating scenario 3. They will have to rent and pay back the $250,000 in debt. Unfortunately, prices could go up while they are renting and it'd be more difficult for them to break back in. Banks may not be able to recoup the debt and then pass on those costs to existing customers. A couple of decades ago, we had the global financial crisis. So initially, loans were given to people who couldn't pay them back. House prices then went down, and then lending institutions couldn't recoup their money and some went bankrupt. To help solve the problem, governments gave lending institutions money to stop them from defaulting. Globally, there were a wide range of negative economic effects. Australia was able to avoid the worst of it, but in general, governments want to avoid something similar to the global financial crisis. As mentioned earlier, governments gave money to banks. My solution is to give money to the people. Let's go back to scenario 3, where if they default on their home, they still owe $250,000. So the GFC solution was that homeowners would lose their home. They would still have the $250,000 in debt unless they declared bankruptcy and had all the issues relating to that. But they also stepped in to give lending institutions money to keep the system stable. My solution would be to give homeowners something like $20,000. They're able to keep their home because now they've got enough of a buffer. Lending institutions will still be able to get most of their money back because the homeowners won't default on their loans. So why does this work so effectively? Well, the most difficult part of a loan is the beginning. It can take around 37 payments of $3,000 to pay off the first $20,000 in principal. So there's a lot of treading water there. So the $20,000 payment has given the homeowner around $110,000 in value. This ends up being a cheaper and more effective way of dealing with the issue of negative equity. But there are some severe limitations. If lending institutions and homeowners know that the government is going to give them money, they'll just borrow more, and whatever advantage my system has will disappear. My solution can only be used for people who are not expecting this money. It can only be applied retrospectively, and new homeowners must be told in no uncertain terms that they will not access this money, otherwise they will borrow more and there will be more of an issue. This is a policy that can only really be used once, and it can only be used when house prices are going down and it's looking like people are going to default. In conclusion, negative equity is not a concern for homeowners unless they default. Bailing out people rather than the lending institutions is a far more cost-effective way of doing things. Bailing out people has its limitation and it can only be used as an emergency measure. It is not effective if people expect it to happen and just borrow more as a result. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the like button. Please leave a review and a comment. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm a mathematics teacher with 20 years experience with a passion for teaching financial literacy. Please read the disclaimer.